All right, welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an instructor in the academic track of the Temple of the Silver Star. This will be our second out of 12 classes on the paths, letters, and correspondences. Okay, so yeah, like I was saying last week, with a kind of introductory and overview, we talked about some theoretical issues around the idea of correspondences, what correspondences mean, different sort of contexts for them, more like symbolic correspondences, alphabetic correspondences, numerical correspondences, as well as kind of practical and what I was sort of calling theurgical correspondences. So correspondences between different powers, celestial powers and stars, and things like stones, plants, animals, and things that are actually used in ritual work. We talked about color correspondences, things like that. Again, just sort of general stuff. Went through some of the history of correspondences, looked at sort of different takes on correspondence at different times. And then we also talked a little bit about how the Hebrew alphabet comes to be kind of the, I don't know quite what the right word is, but something like the master key for correspondences in contemporary Hermetic Kabbalah, and a little bit about some of the kind of complex history of how the Hebrew letters get attributed. So here they are. Here's the Hebrew alphabet. Now, as we go through, you'll see we're going to be focusing on just a fairly small subset of the letters today. So if you're not super familiar with the letters, today should be all right for you. And hopefully you'll actually have learned a few of the letters by the end of the class if you haven't already. But definitely, as we go forward, you're going to want to be pretty familiar with, at least able to recognize, the letters by sight. Again, today we're just going to be talking about primarily 3 of the letters. A few others will become relevant. But then next week and the week after, we'll start talking about like larger groups of the letters, and so you're going to want to be able to recognize them. Okay, so kind of at the end of last class, we ended up with this here. This is our correspondences that we use in contemporary like Hermetic Kabbalah, and specifically the tradition coming through Crowley. This is the correspondences generally used by. See, it should have advanced to the next slide by now. Let's see, someone's saying they could only see the alphabet. Let's see. So these are the correspondences coming out of the cipher manuscript that we used in the Foundation of the Golden Dawn. And then we talked about the change between some of the significations for the letters He and Zadi that Crowley made based on his instructions that he received with the Book of the Law. And so I've made those changes here. And so you can see that, So you can see that He is corresponding with Aquarius and the star, and Zadi is corresponding with Aries and the Emperor. Are people not? People are people having connection issues maybe? Okay. Usually most connection issues are usually local. If you're on a phone, you might want to switch to a laptop. But again, this recording will be available. So if you're a member, you can always see the recording later. Okay, so we're just going to be using this set of correspondences here, and this is kind of where we ended up last time. Was just in this set of correspondences. So I thought it would be interesting. Originally, when I planned at the class, I was just going to do an introductory class, and then for the next 11 sessions, just sort of zoom in on 2 letters per class and really look at them in detail and in their correspondences. Also, and talk a lot about the tarot correspondences. I've decided to rearrange that a little bit. So what we're going to do instead is today we're going to look at, so for this session and the 2 after it, we're going to break the letters into 3 groups, the mother letters, the double letters, and the single letters. And we'll talk about what that means. And then in the last 8 classes, then we'll sort of zoom in on individual letters. But the reason I wanted to break them down into groups first is to give you a little bit more of the sense of the conceptual structure of the alphabet and its correspondences, and also to see them in relationship to. I think if you too quickly zoom in on just the individual letters themselves and say, this corresponds to this, and then you sort of put that away and then go to the next letter and say, this corresponds to this, I think you miss out the fact that these things form relationships and form different groups and different structures and relationships within the alphabet. And so hopefully these next 3 weeks will kind of introduce you to the letters, introduce you to the structure, and introduce you to their relationships that they can form with each other. And then that will give you even better context for jumping in to the specifics. As with all of these things, there's always kind of a back and forth between understanding the total system and then understanding the individual things. You have to have some sense of the kind of total picture in order to be able to understand what the individual members mean. But then understanding what the individual pieces of the system mean is important for understanding the whole. So there's always this kind of back and forth relationship between seeing the things together and in relationship, and then looking at each one individually and understanding its significance. Before we go too much further, I wanted to follow up on just a couple of things I was saying at the very end of last class about sort of my sense of, the attitude to take towards these things. I was talking a little bit about sort of being flexible with them, of understanding that there's going to be times when things overlap, when there are things that at least seem to be asymmetries, when certain letters or correspondences kind of sort of move from one group to another or converge or overlap in different ways. Sorry, it sounds like some people are still having connection issues. You can try refreshing. If it gets really bad, you can try quitting the room and rejoining again. It may just be your connection, unfortunately. Right, so I was sort of trying to encourage a sense of like flexibility and an understanding that these are kind of networks or webs of connection. And I think that it's sort of limiting to think of these things as just like boxes that everything gets put into, and anything that comes up, you just sort of say, oh, which box does it go in? I think it's more useful and also more magical to think of them instead as relationships and as networks that let us join and move between different sets of symbols. And so I think there can be kind of a reductive take on correspondences sometimes. So I was reading recently, Robert Wang has actually a really great book. It's called The Kabbalistic Tarot. It's from a Golden Dawn perspective. He produced a tarot deck, Robert Wang did, under Isru Rigardi's guidance. And he also wrote a book called The Kabbalistic Tarot. So overall, it's a really great book, but I was noticing at the beginning, he's talking about the idea of correspondences and about the correspondences specifically of the Hebrew alphabet to the tarot trumps. And he says, all that is implied by the symbolic picture of the fool is also implied by the Hebrew letter Aleph. Now, I actually kind of disagree with that. I think that the fool and Aleph, while they correspond with each other, and why being able to sort of move back and forth from one to the other in any, if you encounter the letter Aleph, you can then sort of move to the fool or bring in the significance of the fool. But I think that it's going too far to say that like the Aleph and the fool are the same thing. I think that they correspond, and so, the Aleph in the Hebrew alphabet corresponds to the fool in the tarot. But I don't like to think of them as the same thing or as two different symbols for the same thing, but rather as things that correspond. And I think the last point I was trying to make at the end of last class was that these systems of correspondences, like your tables in 777, that these things are a skeleton that need to be fleshed out. They're also a kind of language that we can use to express things. It's not a set of doctrines in and of themselves. And it's also, again, it's skeletal, especially if we're starting to talk about mythological correspondences and things like that. It's not enough to do a ritual just to look and say, oh, this path corresponds with this god, so I'll invoke that god. You understand the mythology of that god, the god's other symbols, how they relate to other gods in their pantheon, and so on. So this is a skeletal structure that needs to be fleshed out. Okay, so in this class, to talk about the three mother letters, we're going to talk about the Sefer Yetzirah, which is where this division of the Hebrew alphabet into three groups comes from, and is also the foundation for all of these correspondences, like we talked about last week. Although, again, there's some differences in tradition and how the correspondences exactly work, but we're not going to worry about that. I talked about that last time. So the Sefer Yetzirah, again, I think I gave a real brief introduction to it. It's one of the most ancient Kabbalistic texts, probably written down somewhere between like the 3rd and 6th century. It's not really clear, and there was almost certainly an oral tradition going back before it was ever written down. There's some, I know, references in the early Talmud to a Sefer Yetzirah, though it's not clear that it's necessarily the same Sefer Yetzirah that we have now. The Hebrew tradition says that the Sefer Yetzirah was originally taught by Abraham, so it goes all the way back to the patriarch, first patriarch. There's also a lot of magical kind of lore and traditions surrounding the Sefer Yetzirah in the Talmud and in some of the Kabbalistic texts. The knowledge of the Sefer Yetzirah and the understanding of which again is a book about the letters and about their structure and relationship and their esoteric meanings. That the understanding of the letters and the understanding of the full significances of the letters and of this text, the Sefer Yetzirah, allows creative power, because the Hebrew alphabet and the Hebrew language is the structure which God used to create the universe. In the Hebrew tradition, the universe was spoken into being, and that Hebrew is the creative language, the language of God. And so the understanding of the letters allows some of this creative power. And so there's traditions of different biblical figures who supposedly had this knowledge of the Sefer Yetzirah and of the meaning of the letters, and were able to do sort of miracles with them and to create living things. There's some in some of the early tradition here that they can actually create both living humans and human souls, as well as animals. Though later this gets interpreted in different ways, that they weren't physical things, but existed something like what we might call a kind of an astral kind of creation. And then in the medieval time, I think kind of 11th, 12th century, this stuff gets associated with the myth of the golem, the creation of an artificial being. And it's always by the letters that the golem is created. There's different traditions about how it happens, but through the writing of letters upon the golem, and also the chanting of letters and permutations of letters, it allows them to create life. And there's some really interesting mythology associated with the golem that you can look into. So, okay, without any further ado, let's jump into some of the Sefer Yetzirah here. We're not going to look at the whole thing. This is from Aryeh Kaplan's translation. He kind of what is the sort of definitive, Jewish tradition, like translation of the Sefer Yetzirah nowadays. So Sefer Yetzirah, just real brief overview. It's split into 6 chapters. Chapter 1 has a little bit of introduction and then mostly covers the 10 Sephiroth. Chapter 2 talks about the 22 letters and also has some kind of meditational instructions, seemingly. Then chapter 3 talks about the 3 mother letters. Chapter 4 talks about the 7 double letters. Chapter 5 talks about the 12 single letters. And then the 6th chapter, which was probably originally a commentary, but eventually became the 6th chapter, has some kind of summary. So we'll talk about some pieces of the 1st and 2nd chapter that are relevant, and then we'll focus on the 3rd chapter today. Okay, so this is verse 1 from chapter 1. And this is obviously the Hebrew at the top, and then the English translation below it. And like I said, this is Aryeh Kaplan's translation. With 32 mystical paths of wisdom engraved Yah, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the living God, King of the universe, El Shaddai, merciful and gracious, high and exalted, dwelling in eternity, whose name is holy. He is lofty and holy, and he created his universe with 3 books, with text, with number, and with communication. Okay, so just talk about a few things here. Now, you see, this is the introduction of these 32 mystical paths of wisdom, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, you see a long list of titles and divine names. Now, as you might expect, there's a lot of Kabbalistic analysis that can be done of these, how those names correspond to the Sephiroth, enumerations of them, other letter and number symbolism that we don't have time to go into here. Then if you look kind of down towards the bottom here, and he created his universe with 3 books. Now, the word for book here is Sepharim. Now, Sefer Yetzirah literally means the book of foundation. Sefer can mean text or book, and Yetzirah means foundation. So Sefer Yetzirah is the book of foundation. And so it's saying here that God created the universe with 3 books, with 3 Sepharim, with text, and that's the word Sefer, with number, Sephar, And the Sephiroth actually share a root with Sephar here. And so where Sephar is number, Sephiroth is plural, Sephira is singular. And Sephira means something like counting. So the Sephiroth are like the 10 Sephiroth are like the 10 countings, or the 10 emanations. Yeah. So with text, Sephir, with number, Sephar, and with communication, Sipur. I've also seen this word Sipur, instead of translated as communication, being translated as with sound. And so there's a lot of different things that you can make out of these three things of text, number, and communication, or text, number, and sound. One way is to talk about 3 ways of sort of looking at the letters and analyzing them. So with Sephir, with text, this would be the actual written letters themselves, their form, their shape, and various significances and correspondences that can be drawn out of what the character actually looks like. With number is with its value, right? So this is all of gematria, other numerical symbolism and numerical significance. And then with communication or with sound, this is with the sound that the letter makes. We won't go into it too much here, but there is a bunch of stuff in the Sefer Yetzirah about the actual sounds. The letters are grouped by like where in the mouth they're pronounced, and there's some really interesting symbolism that's drawn out of that. But we won't go too far into that here. But anyways, you see here these 32 mystical paths of wisdom. And so those 32 paths are the 10 Sephiroth plus the 22 letters. Now, we're not going to talk too much about the Sephiroth here in this class. We're mostly focusing on the letters, but it's important to be sort of aware of them. So this here is the sort of first page of tables from Crowley's 777. And so you'll see Crowley's written them, the columns start on the left, start on the right and move over to the left, kind of in imitation of the way that Hebrew is read. And so you'll see that the key scale here corresponds with the 32 paths of wisdom. And so you've essentially just got the numbers 1 through 32 listed out in the right-hand column. With a couple of extra things, Crowley's added a 0 in here. This is the 0, the ayin, when he's actually divided it into 3 separate, the ayin, ayin sof, and ayin sof r, which are the 3 veils of the negative, that which precedes even existence, the divinity that is so beyond human understanding that to us it is like nothing. That doesn't really form any important part of what we're talking about here, but it's just important to be aware of what that is when you see it in 777. And so the numbers 1 through 10, these are the first 10 of the 32 paths, and they correspond with the 10 Sephiroth. And then our numbers 11 through 32, these are the 22 letters. Now at the bottom, we've got the 32nd and 31st path here, sort of doubled with a second group of correspondences, and we'll get to that. But just for now, just be important to aware that, in 7.7, these things are listed as, 1 to 32 as the 32 paths, with 11 through 32 being the Hebrew letters. And that's exactly what you were seeing in this chart here, where it says like Yetzirah, like Yetziratic correspondence here. You see 11 through 32, that's the path number. So that's something you'll want to get used to looking at. Okay, second verse here from chapter 1. 10 Sephirot of nothingness and 22 foundation letters, 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals. A couple comments on this here. First of all, this phrase, 10 Sephirot of nothingness, that is the literal translation of what it says there, and there's debate about what that means. You'll also see, like in William Wynne Westcott, one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, in his translation, he translates this as 10 ineffable Sephiroth, and that is sort of supported by a lot of Jewish Kabbalistic interpretation, is that nothing here means ineffable, something that we can't understand, and so to us it is like nothing. Though there may also be, I think Kaplan talks about the idea that it's that they're ideal things, that they're not real, actually existing things, but are like something like ideals. We might think of them as being something like Platonic forms or something like that, but they haven't yet entered into existence. Yeah. And then so the 22 foundation letters are the 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals, or what he's calling elementals. So here they are. Here's the alphabet broken up into the 3 mother letters of Aleph, Mem, and Shin, which are the 3 letters we'll be focusing on today. Then the 7 double letters, and then the 12 single or elemental letters. Now, this word elemental here can be a little bit confusing. It doesn't mean elemental like in the sense of the elements, which we will be talking about today, like fire, water, air, and earth. I think it's just the most literal translation of the actual Hebrew word that's used there. And I assume, again, Kaplan doesn't directly discuss this, but I assume the idea is elemental just in the sense of like basic, you know what I mean? But not elemental, like corresponding to the elements. So in Hermetic Kabbalah, we usually call these the single letters, but you'll see in like Jewish sources, they'll be sometimes called elemental letters. So just be prepared for that. And the actual linguistic basis for this, the mother letters are not in any way particularly linguistically like distinguished from the other letters. The ones that are distinguished are the 7 double letters, which are called double because they have a double pronunciation. Well, whether or not all of them actually originally had a double pronunciation, or whether there's a little bit of things being sort of pushed into places that maybe they don't quite fit in order for the correspondences to work, is kind of a question that's been debated. But at least theoretically, and sort of for the sake of what we're doing here, we can say that the double letters are the ones with a double pronunciation. Only some of those double pronunciations have made it into modern Hebrew, and I think like Ashkenazic preserved some of them, and the Sephardic preserved others. But yeah, the idea would be that originally they all had a double pronunciation, whether or not that's actually fully accurate. But for example, like Beth, the first double letter we see here on the right, like the hard Beth is like a B sound, and the soft Beth is a V sound. The second one here, Gimel, like a hard Gimel is a G sound, and a soft Gimel is a J sound. Okay, so that sort of distinguishes the doubles. And then how the mothers are distinguished from the others is, well, I don't know that anyone knows absolutely for sure. This is how Kaplan explains it. So this is the same chart we were looking at a few minutes ago. I've just highlighted them with colors here. The colors don't mean anything significant, so don't read anything into the colors. I'm just trying to distinguish the 3 groups. So I've done the mother letters in red, the double letters in green, and the single letters in blue. Again, for just arbitrarily. So again, if you think the green here, the double letters, that these things are actually distinguished by a linguistic phenomenon of having this double pronunciation. Then the other remaining 15 letters, we can see that the mother letters are approximately sort of first, middle, and last. Shin is actually the second to last letter because the very last letter is a double letter. So it's kind of the closest to the last that isn't a double letter. And then Mem isn't exactly in the center, but it's fairly close. And as we'll see, because Mem, the hieroglyph, the letter Mem and its hieroglyphic origin is actually from a hieroglyph meaning water. It's kind of has to be water. And because Aleph, which is also the first letter, which is of course important, Aleph is the breath sound, and so it kind of has to be air. So again, this isn't quite perfect as first, last, and middle, but it has that kind of significance of being the kind of fundamental or basic pattern under the whole alphabet. Okay, so the rest of chapter 1 from there's 7 or 8 more verses. Those all deal with the Sephiroth, and so we're going to skip over them, but they're quite interesting and to look at. So yeah, we'll look at a few verses from chapter 2 here before we jump into when we'll look at all of chapter 3. Okay, so first verse of chapter 1, 22 foundation letters, 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals. The 3 mothers are Aleph, Mem, Shin. Their foundation is a pan of merit, a pan of liability, and the tongue of decree deciding between them. Now this next text here is in brackets because it doesn't appear in all versions, and probably not in the oldest versions. 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin. Mem hums, Shin hisses, and Aleph is the breath of air deciding between them. Okay, so again, we just have, there's a lot of repetition in the text. So again, we have the repetition of the 22 foundation letters divided into these three groups of mothers, doubles, and then elementals or singles. And the three mothers are stated to be Aleph, Mem, and Shin. Let's see. So their foundation is a pan of merit and a pan of liability. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But this last thing here, Mem hums, Shin hisses, and Aleph is the breath of air between them. This is talking about the sound, right? Mem is a M sound, like the humming. Shin is the S, the sibilant sound, so it's a hissing sound, and Aleph is the breath sound. Okay, so this thing about the foundation is a pan of merit and a pan of liability. I think it'll be a little easier if you sort of arrange them here. So we've got Aleph at the top, and then Mem here on the right, and then Shin on the left. So this thing about the two pans, the images of a scales, like an old kind of scale, right? The two things that go up and down, those are the pans, the things that you place things on. So the image here is of a scale. And so the pan of merit and the pan of liability, we can think of these as sort of corresponding like to the columns on the tree of life of mercy and severity. We have a similar sort of idea. And again, and Aleph is the tongue, or which is like the what's the word I'm looking for? The sort of the pointer on the scale, the thing that shows whether or not it's in balance. So Aleph is the kind of the thing deciding between them at the point of the balance and sort of showing the balance. So they call it the tongue of decree there. So we're getting this kind of basic picture of Mem and Shin as sort of opposite things that are balanced against each other, and Aleph as the thing at the center, which sort of decides between them, sort of reconciles between them, harmonizes them. Okay, so verse 2 here from chapter 2. 22 foundation letters. He engraved them, he carved them, he permuted them, he weighed them, he transformed them. And with them, he depicted all that was formed and all that would be formed. So again, we can see some of this sort of mystical significance of the letters as the foundation of things. Then there's a really interesting thing that happens with the Hebrew grammar here that Kaplan talks about, which is that because of just some ambiguity, it can be read either as the way he's rendered it here, as all being in sort of third person masculine singular, or you can read it as being in second person, second person singular, which is like the imperative. So instead of saying he engraved them, he carved them, it's instructing you, 22 foundation letters, engrave them, carve them, permute them, weigh them, transform them, and with them depict all that was formed and all that would be formed. And so the idea here is that these are probably meditational instructions, that you're supposed to take the letters and then, engrave them, carve them, permute them, weigh them, transform them. That these are instructions for actually working with the letters. And there's, a lot of different traditions that have, specifics about how these things are done. But we can definitely think about this idea of engraving, carving, permuting. Engraving and carving, we can think of this as an inner process, a process of concentration and meditation of forming these things, as interior symbols, as interior realities, and then working with them in different ways, permuting them, weighing them, transforming them, and then using them to depict all things. Which, in one way of using them to depict all things is to think about how everything corresponds to them and how they correspond to, cosmologies and cosmogonies and all of that. Okay, so there's more kind of stuff along this line in chapter 2 that we don't have time to go over, but I just wanted to show you one more verse from chapter 2 just to give you a little bit of the flavor of what's going on here, though we're not going to, I won't say more about this verse, but just read it. He formed, and again, with this a lot of this stuff, again, can be read as in an imperative, as like an instruction rather than as a statement about God. He formed substance out of chaos and made non-existence into existence. He carved great pillars from air that cannot be grasped. This is a sign, Aleph with them all, and all of them with Aleph. He foresees, transforms, and makes all that is formed and all that is spoken. One name, a sign for this thing, 22 objects in a single body. So again, we're not going to sort of get into that, but I just wanted to give you some of the flavor of what's happening here and the kind of level that we're talking at. Okay, so now we're going to move into chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with the mother letters, and so we'll go through the whole thing and talk about it as we go along. Okay, so chapter 3, verse 1. 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin. Their foundation is a pan of merit, a pan of liability, and the tongue of decree deciding between them. So again, this is a repetition of what we saw from chapter 2. And I think this sort of arrangement will be useful for us in looking at their arrangements. And again, this idea of Mem and Shin as the extremes, the polarity that are kind of like weighed or balanced against each other, and then Aleph as the thing that decides between them and that balances them. All right, so verse 2. 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, a great mystical secret, covered and sealed with 6 rings, and from them emanated air, water, and fire, and from them are born fathers, and from the fathers descendants. Okay, so this first thing here, a great mystical secret covered and sealed with 6 rings. This is a little bit obscure. Kaplan has some discussion about it. The 6 rings probably refer to like the 6 directions. So, above, below, east, west, north, and south. And there's some relationship here with something called the cube of space, which we're not going to get into today, and maybe we'll talk about it next week. We'll see. But again, this sort of the idea of the 6 directions here is probably what's being referenced. Okay, and from them emanated air, water, and fire. So now we have this direct presentation of the 3 elements in connection with the 3 mother letters. And then this last part here about them being from the mothers or born fathers and from the fathers' descendants, that's something we'll come back to after we've gone through the other verses. Okay, so the main thing we've gotten here now is the attributions of the letters to the elements. So again, Aleph very naturally corresponds to air. It is the breath sound, and air is associated obviously with breath. And there's several different words that can mean spirit in Hebrew, and one of these is ruach, and several different words that can also mean breath. One of these is ruach, which is attributed to air in the Kabbalistic parts of the soul, which we won't get too deeply into here. But again, so this air has the symbolism of spirit and of breath, and the breath of vitality, the life breath, all of that, that sort of thing. Mem, again, means water. It's the origin of that hieroglyph. And then Shin comes to mean fire here. So again, we see the fire and water as the polarities here, as the polarities being balanced, and then air as their point of reconciliation. Now, as we kind of talked about in a little bit in the last series of classes that I did on the elements and the pentagram, air is often seen as kind of the product or the child of fire and water. Though here it's actually being pictured almost as something higher than them, something more primordial. So this is another kind of example of the way that these things can be reconfigured in different contexts. It's not always that the order, fire, water, air, earth, that is the kind of default in Hermetic Kabbalah, but there's times that the ordering is different for different reasons. And obviously, we're talking about a set of 3 elements here rather than 4 or 5, though we will talk about 4 and 5 by the end of today. Okay, so here's verse 3, a little blurry there, but okay, verse 3. 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin. He engraved them, he carved them, he permuted them, he weighed them, he transformed them. And with them he depicted 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin in the universe, 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin in the year, 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin in the soul, male and female. So the first half of that is just repetition of things we've already seen. But we now see that the 3 mothers are being used to depict and with them he depicted 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, in the universe. So these 3 mothers are all appearing in the universe, in the year, and in the soul. And so universe, we can think of this as space, the space, right? In the year, we can think of this as time, and then soul is like a spiritual dimension. In Kaplan's translation, he actually talks about this as a kind of 5-dimensional sort of presentation, where you have the 3 dimensions of the 3 spatial dimensions, plus the time dimension, plus a 5th like spiritual dimension. That to me seems like a little anachronistic. The idea of the kind of dimensions like that and like higher dimensional things seems more modern, but I don't know, it sort of works for Kaplan. But again, I think that's the basic idea there is correct, that we're talking about the physical universe defined by space, the year as time. Although it's interesting that a year, right, is a kind of circular, it's like a kind of cyclic image of time here. And then the soul is like a spiritual dimension. And we do see those actually being kind of used as dimensions. They're being the 3 spatial dimensions are spoken of, up and down, east, west, and north, south, and then also, before and after, the 2 time polarities. And then in the soul, it's usually portrayed as good and evil, is a kind of the polarity for the spiritual dimension. Okay, and so the Sefer Yetzirah itself doesn't actually specify how the 3 mother letters are attributed to the 3 axes, the 3 directions. This is something that actually gets worked out by Paul Foster Case. I won't go through his reasoning here, but this is what he comes up with, and this is what sort of people using the cube of space and things like that always kind of follow: is Aleph as the up-down dimension, Mem as the east-west dimension, and then Shin as the north-south dimension. Yeah, I've mentioned the cube of space a couple of times. Let's talk about that at least briefly next week, because it'll make more sense when we have Paul Foster Case. He's the founder of the Builders of the Adytum, a kind of Golden Dawn continuation order. Let's see. Yeah, so we'll come back to the cube of space. Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Okay, so let's see. Let's do verse 4 here. And yeah, I think because I've mentioned the cube of space a couple of times, we can maybe talk about it next week. It'll make more sense when we have more things to put in the cube. Right now, we would just have the 3 spatial dimensions. But you'll see it gets more elaborate. Okay, so verse 4 here. 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, in the universe are air, water, fire. Heaven was created from fire. Earth was created from water. And air from breath decides between them. So now in the last verse, we had seen that it was sort of introduced that these are going to appear in the universe, in the year, and in the soul. Now we're going to look at those 3 things individually. So here we're looking at them in the universe as air, water, and fire. So it's saying that heaven was created from fire, earth is created from water, and then air, again, which is sort of from breath, is deciding between them. So we have an arrangement that we could kind of picture, maybe something like this, with Mem for water, Aleph at the bottom, Aleph for air in the center, and then the Shin for fire at the top. Whenever I convert this into a PDF, it always moves the triangles up to the top of the box as I center them, and then it changes them every time. It really irritates me. I don't know why it does that. But anyways, you can see the kind of the presentation here. Again, it's only with 3 letters rather than 4, but it's similar to a lot of classical presentations where you have, fire as the highest thing, the thing that's the hottest, and rises the highest, like the aether that exists, above the atmosphere. And then, air as the kind of middle realm, where we exist, and, where birds and flying things are as well. And then below that, you have the realms of water and earth as the heavier elements that descend. Though here, it's just being configured as just 3 because there are 22 Hebrew letters. Okay, now we looked at universe, so now we'll look at the 3 mothers in the year. 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, in the year are the hot, the cold, and the temperate. The hot is created from fire, the cold is created from water, and the temperate from breath decides between them. So again, we can see this sort of repetition and also the kind of repeating structures of Mem and Shin as polarities, and then air, Aleph, as the thing that decides between them. So this hot, cold, and temperate in the year, this is usually interpreted as the seasons. So the hot is summer, the cold is winter, and then the temperate is both spring and fall. So the hot summer is created from fire, from the letter Shin. The cold is created from water, from Mem. And then the temperate, which is both spring and fall, is created from breath and decides between them, which makes a lot of sense, right? That spring and fall are the midpoints between the two extremes. So yeah, it makes sense. And we can also see how we're kind of moving from like a 3 to a 4, where we've got 3 things, Aleph, Mem, and Shin, but there are 4 seasons of the year. And so Aleph is doing this sort of double duty as the midpoint on both sides of the wheel, which is a pattern, sort of similar thing we'll see again when we see another kind of 4 emerging out of the 3. All right, so we've looked at universe and the year. So now we'll look at the mother letters in the soul. 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, in the soul, male and female, are the head, belly, and chest. The head is created from fire, the belly is created from water, and the chest from breath decides between them. So the male and female there, it just means both male and female souls. At least that's my understanding. So here they're being, the letters are now being equated to the parts of the body, the head, the belly, and the chest. Head created from fire, belly from water, and the chest from air decides between them. Now, obviously, the chest for air makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's where your lungs are. That's where breathing happens. Belly from water, makes a lot of sense. And then you can also see how it's using the same sort of spatial arrangement as was being used in the universe, which is this again, right? So we've got the belly, Mem, and water, the chest, Aleph, and air, and then the head, Shin, or fire. Now, there's something you'll see, this is part of the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, not in the Hebrew tradition, is the 3 mother letters arranged vertically like this and equated with the caduceus of Hermes. So there on the right, you can see the 3 mother letters written in a kind of stylized way around a central pillar. There's the Mem at the bottom, Aleph in the middle, and Shin at the top. And there's at least one version of the caduceus here. So you can see that the 3 kind of yods at the top of the Shin correspond with the central disc and the 2 wings. The tops of the Aleph there correspond with the heads of the serpents. And then the rest of the Aleph, hey, stop. Cat misbehaving here. And then the lower part of the Aleph and the Mem is the twining of the serpent's bodies. Yeah. And so from here, so this is obviously kind of arranged vertically, where you've got the polarity of fire at the top, the polarity of water at the bottom, and then air in the center between them. But arranging them like this, like the caduceus, also lets us look at a different form of triad, where you have 2 extremes and something in the center. And so looking on the left here, you can see that the 2 extremes are going to be the 2 serpents coiling around the caduceus, and then the center thing, the thing that reconciles between them, is going to be that central channel. So in the Hermetic Kabbalistic symbolism, the symbol of the caduceus, of the central channel with the 2 serpents twining around it, is often equated to the 3 primary nadis of the Indian tradition. So there at the top, we've got a diagram there showing the symbols there are for the chakras. The 6 or 7. Sahasrara, the crown, what we call the crown chakra, is usually not considered a chakra. But anyways, it's a different issue there. But you can see the same shape, right, of the same pattern of the central channel, and then the 2 kind of serpentine channels winding around it. So the central channel is called the Sushumna. Now, of the 2 channels here, the other 2 here, they kind of coil around each other. So the one that eventually, they're seen as rising upward. The one that eventually connects to the left nostril is called the Ida, and it's cool and lunar. The one that eventually connects to the right nostril is called Pingala, and it's hot and solar. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, there's a lot that we could say about this here, but we're not going to. I don't have time to go too deeply into sort of the Indian subtle anatomy theories. But an important thing to be aware of, and that we can kind of equate these to the three mother letters. Now, it doesn't work out exactly or in every context. The Shushumna, the central channel, is often described as being fiery, whereas we might think of it maybe working a little better with the three mother letters as air. In Indian texts, and often is described as fire. And in its correlation with the Kundalini, normally the Kundalini is sleeping or in a dormant state, like in the lowest, in the Muladhara chakra there. And then when the other two currents, so the Ida and the Pingala, sort of merge at the base of the spine and open up the bottom channel, which is kind of very complex process, then the energies can flow up the central channel and the Kundalini can rise and affect illumination and spiritual awakening. So again, the correspondences don't work out exactly, but it is obviously a manifestation of a very fundamental triadic sort of structure. And I think it's interesting the way the Kundalini here, or sorry, not Kundalini, the caduceus here can be seen as these two different types of triads, one kind of arranged vertically and then one arranged horizontally. Okay, let's keep moving. All right, so chapters or verse 7, 8, and 9. So we've now gone through and seen the three mother letters, their basic correspondences, and then how they appear in the universe, in the year, and in the soul. And now this information will just be kind of summarized and presented in a little bit differently in the last three verses here. So he made the letter Aleph king over breath, and he bound a crown to it, and he combined them one with another. And with them he formed air in the universe, the temperate in the year, and the chest in the soul. The male with Aleph Mem Shin, and the female with Aleph Shin Mem. So now we're talking about Aleph not just corresponding with breath, but being king over breath. And there's a tradition within Kabbalah, sort of Jewish Kabbalah, of the letters having crowns. Some of you may have seen images, or you may know something about this, or have seen images of the letters depicted with crowns on top of them. Crown is obviously connected to the Sephira Kether, the highest Sephira, which means crown. And there's a lot of kind of mystical secrets and things like that here. The idea of being bound to the crown could be seen as being bound to the highest or connected to the highest. And then we're just sort of summarizing the attributions of Aleph here. So it's king over breath and forms air in the universe, the temperate in the soul, or the temperate in the year, and the chest in the soul. Now these two different, the Aleph Mem Shin being connected with the male and Aleph Shin Mem being connected with the female. This has to do with some gematria about how the words for man and woman are spelled in Hebrew, but they're not super relevant for our purposes. So I'm just going to move on. All right, so that was Aleph. Now we're going to look at Mem. He made Mem king over water, and he bound a crown to it, and he combined one with another. And with them he formed earth in the universe, cold in the year, and the belly and the soul. The male with Mem Aleph Shin, and the female with Mem Shin Aleph. So again, Mem is king over water. It too is having a crown bound to it, and it's being combined with the other letters and used to form the parts of the universe, the year, and the soul. And then the letters that were spelling out the masculine and feminine formulas are just sort of being permuted here. All right, and then lastly, he made Shin king over fire, and he bound a crown to it, and he combined one with another, and with them he formed heaven in the universe, hot in the year, and the head in the soul. The male with Shin Aleph Mem, and the female with Shin Mem Aleph. So again, Shin is king over fire, has a crown bound to it, and corresponds to heaven in the universe, the hot or summer in the year, and the head in the soul or in the subtle anatomy. And again, just sort of more permutations of the letters here for male and female that aren't relevant. Okay, so that's all of chapter 3. So that's as far as we're going to get through. Though we are going to jump back and look at verse 2 from chapter 3 here, which I had skipped over part of. So specifically these last two lines, and from them are born fathers, and from the fathers descendants. So the idea of the descent, I'll sort of do this in slightly backwards order here. The idea of the descendants, the idea here is once the fathers exist, there can be now you have fathers and mothers, and so there can be procreation and creation. You see, there's a lot of procreative and even sexual symbolism that happens in Jewish Kabbalah. Which is obviously relevant for us for Thelema as well. But it's interesting to see it in that a different context as well. But there is obviously a kind of procreative idea here of the three mother letters and the three father letters, and then them producing other forms and other things. So again, we have the three mothers of Aleph, Mem, and Shin that we've been talking about all along, and now we also have three fathers. There's some, controversy or uncertainty about it, and how exactly it happens is not super relevant for our purposes, especially because some of the correspondences don't quite match what's used in like Hermetic Kabbalah, so I don't want to confuse anyone. But the point is that the three fathers are Yod, He, and Vav. So again, which descends from which again, isn't super relevant and will probably just be more confusing than helpful. But just this idea that the three fathers, Yod, He, and Vav, are being produced by or out of the three mothers. Okay, so you probably recognize these three letters, Yod, He, and Vav, as the three letters that make up the Tetragrammaton, which is spelled, it's Tetragrammaton literally means four-lettered name, but it's spelled using just these three letters, Yod, He, Vav, and then repetition of the He as the fourth letter. So as we talked about in good detail in the last series on the elements in the pentagram, these four letters correspond with the four elements. Yod with fire, He with water, Vav with air, and then He final with earth. And they also correspond with four persons. So the Yod of the Tetragrammaton is the father of Tetragrammaton, He is the mother of Tetragrammaton, Vav is the son, and then the final He is the daughter. Let's see. I had some. I had some stuff on the four elements that I was thinking about reading from Agrippa. Let's see how we do on time. If we have time, I'll come back to that at the end. But I'd rather just sort of move on. And most people here, I'm sure, are familiar with the basic idea of the four elements. And what those the kind of basic significances of them. Again, as I was talking about in the last sort of class, I think rather than thinking like, oh, fire is a substance or fire is a particularly defined thing, it's more useful, I think, to talk about these things as in relationship to each other as a way of sort of dividing things up and as a kind of schema or like a correspondence schema that can be applied to a lot of different situations, rather than thinking like, oh, fire has an essence or something like that necessarily. I think it makes more sense to talk about them as a group and as a way of dividing up things into four parts that interact and correspond in certain ways. But again, I'll come back to some stuff on the elements if we have time at the end. Okay, so I wanted to show just sort of an interesting piece of gematria. The specifics here, or I don't know if this is exactly gematria, but some Kabbalistic manipulation of letters that involves the three mothers. The exact specifics here aren't super important. So don't sort of worry about it. I just think it's a kind of interesting demonstration of some of the things that you can do with letter symbolism and specifically with the three mothers. Okay, so in the top sort of section here, I've written two different divine names. On the left, we've got the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. And on the right, we have the divine name Eheye, which means I am, or existence is, something like that. So Eheye is Aleph He Yod He. And obviously we've got the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. And you can see that Eheye ends in Yod He, and Tetragrammaton begins with Yod He. So if we kind of, in the middle section here, I've lined them up so that you can see the last two letters, Aleph He Yod He, and that kind of lining up with the first two letters, the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. And so you kind of squish these together. We can create a new name of 6 letters, Aleph He Yod He Vav He. Right, so the first 4 letters make up the name Eheye, and then the last 4 letters make up the Tetragrammaton, and they're overlapping in the center at the Yod He. So this is a new divine name that it doesn't appear in text and things like that, but it can be created by this way of manipulating the letters. And this has a value of 32. Because 32 is, the total number of paths, this divine name is therefore said to have the significance of totality, representing the 10 Sephiroth and the 22 paths. And so it's a kind of complete or total word, because 32 necessarily, has that symbolism by virtue of the 32 paths. So then if we take this new word that we've formed, Aleph, He, Yod, He, Vav, He, up at the top. So what I've done here is I've just sort of slid down there's 3 He's in there, alternating. He, Aleph, He, Yod, He, Vav, He. And so you've got 3 He's here. And as we were saying in the Tetragrammaton, He is the letter of the mother. So we've got 3 mothers here, right? 3 He's, 3 mothers. And so the thought was then, okay, we've got 3 mothers, so these 3 He's must be a kind of stand-in or veil for the 3 mother letters of Aleph, Mem, and Shin. So now if you replace the 3 He's with the three mothers with the 3 mother letters, you then get a new word, which would be spelled Aleph, Aleph, Yod, Mem, Aleph, Aleph, Yod, Mem, Vav, Shin. This isn't an actual word. But of course, in Hebrew, because none of the letters are vowels, you can come up with a pronunciation for any string of letters. There are no unpronounceable, strings of letters in Hebrew. There's lots of different ways depending on which vowels you put in. But anyways, you create this kind of artificial word here, which has a value of 358. Some of you may be familiar with some of the significances of that number already. There's a lot to it. The 358 are Fibonacci numbers. Some of the basic geometry of the pentagram can be pulled out of 358. It also sums to a couple of important words like Nechesh, which means serpent, and Messiach, which means Messiah. And so this equation of the serpent and the Messiah is something that people have made a lot of in the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition. And something I also noticed is that, so this 358, right, means serpent. And I just say that the word in its kind of untransformed state is 32. And 32 is the value of the word lev, lamed beth, which means heart. And if anybody's familiar with Crowley's Liber 65, one of the Thelemic holy books, the heart girt with the serpent. This is actually a kind of Kabbalistic equation of the heart with the serpent by this method, which I thought was interesting. Okay, so let's shift gears here a little bit. All right, so coming back to 777 here. So we've seen that, let's see. I guess I just wanted to show this again. I'm trying to remember why I put this slide in this order. Just sort of show this again to sort of bring back the idea of these tables of correspondence and the key scale here, and how to actually use them, and sort of how to read them and relate them to the different groups of the letters. So let's look at the 5 elements now. So we've got fire, water, spirit, air, and earth. I put them in that order so that they align with the Pentagrammaton, and that's what you'll see in the top line of Hebrew here. That's Yod, He, Shin, Vav, He. That's the Pentagrammaton, which is, you take the Tetragrammaton and then add the letter Shin into the center. This was something done by the Christian Kabbalists in the Renaissance as a kind of Hermetic or Kabbalistic spelling of the name Jesus, which I talked about that in the last series on the elements. Right, so you've got the Pentagrammaton here, Yod, He, Shin, Vav, He, and its correspondences with the 5 elements now. And now we can also look at another set of Hebrew letters corresponding with the 5 elements. Okay, so things are going to get a little bit complicated here, so just try to bear with me. Okay, so again, we're arranging here as the Pentagrammaton. So we'll kind of go from right to left here. Now, Shin attributed to fire, we've already seen that Shin is attributed to fire. Mem attributed to water, again, we've already seen that. Now, Shin is also being attributed here to spirit, just sort of by virtue of Shin in its use in the Pentagrammaton. Though interestingly, we also saw in the Sefer Yetzirah there that idea that heaven is from fire, or I forget exactly how it phrased it, but the idea that heaven sort of comes out of fire, which I thought was interesting, that spirit obviously would kind of correspond to heaven in some sense. And so there's an interesting resonance there with, Shin being the letter of both fire and spirit. Now, Aleph corresponded with air, as we've seen. And now Earth doesn't really correspond with any of them. And so what happens with Earth is that the letter Tav, which is one of the double letters, and normally is attributed to Saturn, gets kind of brought in to serve double duty as the letter for Earth. Again, because there's only 22 Hebrew letters, 7 of them are taken up by the doubles, the planetary letters. 12 of them are taken up by the zodiac, the letters attributed to the zodiac, and that only leaves the 3 left for the 3 mother letters attributed to fire, water, and air. But in the Hermetic Kabbalah, you often want to be able to work with 4 elements or with 5 elements, and so you need some way of arranging this all into the tables of correspondence. So Tav is used. So on the very last line here, the numbers, these are the key scale numbers like that we saw in 777. So Shin is the 31st path. Mem is the 23rd path. Now Shin, again, is obviously the 31st path, and this is going to be what Crowley is going to call a 31 bis. Now this BIS, bis, as I'm pronouncing it, I've seen some people have thought it was French, some people have thought it was Latin. I think it makes most sense to think of it as Latin, and it means something like twice or again. And so obviously the bi is the same as like the root in bisected, to divide something, to double something. So this is like 31 doubled or 31, again. Now Aleph was the 11th path, right? It's the first letter after the 10 Sephiroth, so it's the 11th path. And then Tav is the 32nd path, 22nd letter, 32nd path. And because this is a secondary or double attribution, we'll see it listed in 777 as 32 bis. So these 5 numbers here, 31, 23, 31 bis, 11, and 32 bis are key scale for the elements. So now if we look at this again, so if we want to see correspondences to air, we'll look for the 11th path. That's where my pointer is there. And then you just sort of read across for correspondences to Aleph and for air. Again, don't worry about the specific content here. I'm just showing you an example table. The 23rd path here, that would be Mem for correspondences for water. 31 will get fire. 32, now 32 by itself, that'll be for Saturn. 32 bis, that will be for Earth. And then 31 bis will be for spirit. Now you can see what Crowley's done here in kind of like putting the numbers into that column there is he's got the Sephiroth like kind of centered down the middle. And then for 11 through 32, he's put the paths for the elements kind of justified over to the left. And then the paths for the planets in the center, and then the paths for the zodiac signs on the right. So you can see how 11, 23, 31, 32 bis, and 31 bis are to the left. And then like the double letters are down the middle, and then the zodiacal letters are on the right. It is a little bit confusing having to kind of to look at it that way rather than grouped what might be more naturally as like elements, then planets, then zodiac signs. And if you've ever seen Stephen Skinner's book, Complete Magician's Tables, he actually rearranges it that way where he presents like the elemental correspondences, like you'll get the Sephirothic correspondences, then the elementals, then the planets, then the zodiac. Maybe not in exactly that order, but he kind of rearranges them in what he thinks is a more natural way. And I think there's something to that. Okay, let me just make sure I haven't missed anything here. 1 second. No, okay. So in 777, you see how it says like table 1 here up at the top. You'll see that the different columns are grouped into a few different tables. And so in table 1, we've got all 32 paths being listed out. And so anything that makes sense for being attributed to, groups of things that can be attributed to all of the paths or some subset or grouping of the paths gets put into table 1. And then in table 2, we have correspondences just for the elements. And so these are actually, this is small. We'll zoom in on some of these in particular. But you can see here, this is table 2. And what you've got here is just the numbers 11, 23, 31, 32 bis, and 31 bis. So these are correspondences just for the elements. And again, we'll zoom in on that a little. Then you've also got, in 777, you've got table 3, sorry, where the 7 double letters, the planetary paths are found. So that's for, planetary correspondences only. Let's see, I'm trying to remember what order he puts them in here. And then in table 4, he puts just the 10 Sephiroth. And then in table 5, he's got the zodiacal paths. And then table 6, he's got things that are attributed just to the 22 letters, like the trumps, the Yetziratic attributions, and things like that. So that can just be helpful if you're sort of dealing with 777. All of a sudden, you go from having like these lists of 32 things to then just having these smaller groups of things with numbers that might look a little bit confusing. But he's just kind of breaking out correspondences that are sort of elemental specific, that are planetary specific, and so on. Okay, so these are our correspondences for just the elements specifically. Again, there's a lot of other relevant correspondences drawn from the other tables, but we'll just take a look at a few of these. Yeah, Stephen Skinner, he's the book, it's called The Complete Magician's Tables. It's an interesting book. It's useful. He does some things differently than the way that Crowley and the Golden Dawn does it. He also has it in his kind of foreword or introduction to that book. He presents a lot of the facts about the historical situation. I don't disagree with his presentation of the facts, but he does kind of present it in a way that makes the Golden Dawn not look so great, and he kind of presents it as if the Golden Dawn correspondence system doesn't make a lot of sense. So I kind of disagree with the way he's interpreting some of the stuff, but just the historical information in itself is pretty good. And it's a useful table. And he brings in a lot of other stuff that isn't found anywhere in like 777. A lot of Chinese and like Taoist material and other things as well. Stuff from other grimoires, that weren't known in Crowley and the Golden Dawn's time. So yeah, it's a useful, interesting book. But again, to sort of take it with a grain of salt and be aware of his opinions. Yeah, definitely easier to read. Also easier to read is Jim Eshelman's book, it's kind of really silly title. It's called 776.5 because it's not quite 777. I think he could have come up with a better title for it. But he presents a lot of the material from 777, but corrected and reformatted. There are errors in 777. There's some spelling mistakes and things like that. So he represents them. He reorganizes the whole thing in a way that's it's printed nicer. It's easier to read. It's better organized. He's also got some useful notes. Some additional material, and like I said, some corrections as well. So that's by Jim Eshelman. It's called... Oh, here, I've got my copy right here, actually. 776.5. But yeah, you can see that it's all, it's all very nicely and clearly laid out. Much better than 777. So that's a useful resource as well. Oh yeah, that's true. The excerpt in book 4 also is reformatted nicely. Thanks, I forgot about that. And again, that's not all of the material from 777, but it has a lot of the primary stuff. And that may have corrected some of the errors too. Yeah. So that could be another good resource, and I'm sure a lot of you will probably already own a copy of that. Okay, so with the time we've got here, let's take a look at some of the specific correspondences to the 5 elements. So again, just remembering how our key scale works here. 11, this is Aleph and air. 23, that's Mem and water. 31, that's fire and Shin. 32 bis is the secondary attribution of Tav to earth. And 31 bis is the secondary attribution to Shin of spirit. So from top down, we've got air, water, fire, earth, spirit. So it's kind of in alphabetical order, not in the most logical order for the elements. All right. So again, we're reading right to left here. Crowley arranges it that way. So in column 65 here, we got the key scale on the right, and then in column 65 here, the letters of the name, right? So Vav corresponds with air, He corresponds with water, Yod corresponds with fire, He final corresponds with earth, and Shin corresponds with spirit, right? So this is the letters of the pentagrammaton. And then in column 55 here, for whatever reason, we've got two different things here. We've got the elements themselves and also the senses. So again, we've got air, water, fire, earth, and spirit, and then them being attributed to the five senses: air to smell, water to taste, fire to sight, earth to touch, and spirit to hearing. That set of correspondences can be really nice. Crowley sometimes talks about like a Eucharist of five elements the kind of the Eucharist, or the elements being partaken of, are the five senses. So you'd have something that you could smell, something that you could taste, something to see, something to touch, and then a sound that you could hear, as a way of doing a kind of fivefold Eucharist. You can. And he talks about that in book 4, and it's also relevant for the Mass of the Phoenix as well. All right, then next we've got the 4 rivers. These are the 4 rivers flowing out of Eden. Not super relevant for our purposes here, but they can be attributed to the elements, to the letters of Tetragrammaton. You could analyze Kabbalistic and biblical symbolism and things like that. The 4 quarters. So this is east, west, south, and north, and then also the names of those quarters in Hebrew. These are the same correspondences we saw, like with the when we were talking about the lesser ritual of the pentagram. We had and actually we'll see the archangels here in just a moment. The supreme elemental kings, this is from the Enochian system. These are, elemental kings, Enochian elemental kings, which could be handy when you're doing Enochian work. And we also have the archangels of the quarters. So this at the top for air is Raphael. For water, that's Gabriel. That's Michael, the archangel of fire. And then Uriel, the archangel of earth. And so you'll see these archangels and the quarters all correspond with, like in the lesser ritual of the pentagram. You've got, Raphael in the east for the archangel of air. You've got Gabriel in the west for water, Michael in the south for fire, and Uriel in the north for earth. All right, and then a few more columns here. Rulers of the elements. This is, again, more hierarchies here. We won't go through it all. Some other angels attributed to the elements, again, useful for practical magical work. And then also the kings of the elemental spirits listed there as well. So again, these sort of hierarchies are useful for practical workings when you want to invoke them and invoke their powers. All right, another important thing here is the 4 worlds. So obviously you see that the 31 beasts attributed to spirit as simply being left blank through all of these, because we're now looking at these a fourfold correspondence to the 4 elements. So I'll just show you what Crowley's got here, and then I'll talk a little bit more on my own slide about the 4 worlds. So corresponding with air is Yetzirah, the formative world. Now these are the secret names of the 4 worlds. Which are just, anyway, I won't go into that, but anyways, here are the 4 worlds. They also have secret names and then numbers corresponding with that. I'm just not going to go into that here. And then also there's this tradition of the Tetragrammaton, the letters of the Tetragrammaton being spelled differently in each of the 4 worlds. So the letters are being spelled out in full, but it's being spelled differently in each of the 4 worlds. Again, don't worry about that. I'm just showing you some of the stuff that you can find in 777. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the 4 worlds here, and that will actually become relevant for some of our course. Beyond just the fact that the elements correspond to the 4 worlds, understanding a basic sense of the 4 worlds is also helpful for understanding things like some of the hierarchies that we'll look at, and also the color scales. Okay, so the highest world, which corresponds with the yod of Tetragrammaton. I didn't write the Tetragrammaton in here. Corresponds with the yod of Tetragrammaton, and with the element of fire is Atziluth. Atziluth is the archetypal world, but we need to be careful about this word archetypal. It does not mean archetypal in like the Jungian sense of archetypes. The idea of Jungian archetypes would more properly fit into Bria, the second world down, but that is just the name of it in the Kabbalah. So let's see, I'll actually go through, let's see. So Atziluth, attributed to fire, to Yod of Tetragrammaton. This is the archetypal world. It is the world of deity. So things like divine names, these that get used, these can all be attributed to the world of Atziluth. Sometimes God forms, deity forms are also attributed to Atziluth. In the tarot, it corresponds to the suit of wands. And in the court cards, it corresponds to the knights of the court cards. And then in the 4 color scales, it corresponds to the king scale of color. And then Bria, attributed to water, that's the creative world, corresponds to the archangels. excuse me, to cups in the tarot, to the queens of the court cards, and to the queen scale of color. The world Yetzirah. I know this is Yetzirah. This is the same word as Sefer Yetzirah. So this is the formative world, just like Sefer Yetzirah is the book of formation. It corresponds with air. It corresponds with the angels, with swords in the tarot, with the princes, and with the color scale that's either called the prince scale or sometimes the emperor scale. So I think Crowley calls it emperor and empress in 777, though a lot of others have called it prince and princess instead. So just be aware of that. So where Atziluth was kind of the world of deity itself, almost completely transcendent, Bria is sort of super consciousness beyond the awareness of most of us. But one way of defining, the adept in the kind of AA and thelemic sense, someone who has knowledge and conversation, is someone who has access to the world of Bria at will. Doesn't mean that people below the adept grade cannot ever have any kind of access to Bria, but it's not conscious, it's not willed, and it usually sort of comes through the subconscious, like through dreams or through symbols and things like that. Whereas the idea is the adept has conscious access to this world. Now, Yetzirah is something pretty close to what we would call the astral. It's the kind of immaterial skeleton that lies behind the material world. It's also the kind of the mental world in the more ordinary sense of mental, ideas, thoughts, numbers, this type of stuff can all be thought of as Yetziratic. When you're talking about traveling in the astral plane or the astral body, that's all kind of Yetzirah level stuff. And then finally, our last world here is Asaya, corresponding with Earth, the world of action. Now, action here, we can also think of it as almost like the world of karma. Karma means action and is the law of like cause and effect. So we can even think of Asaya as like the karmic world. So that corresponds with matter, with the actual physical material. In the Hebrew tradition, it's actually still a little bit above matter, but in the Hermetic kind of Kabbalistic tradition, we usually say that it is the world of matter rather than something slightly above it. Corresponds with discs in the tarot, with the princesses in the court cards, and with the princess or empress scale of color. All right, and then I think this will be the last one I show. Look at the left one first here. So this is attributions to the pentagram. If you were in my last class, the last series I did on the elements of the pentagram, we spent a bunch of time talking about this. This is the attributions of the 5 elements to the points of the pentagram. So you see air attributed to the upper left point, water to the upper right, and so on. Spirit to the top. And then we also see the 3 alchemical elements. Now they're a little bit hard to read, and I just scanned this out of 777, but it's not great quality there. So I've reproduced them there at the bottom. You'll see that Mercury here in 777 has got like a little pointer kind of on the bottom, like right there. Like what Mars has got the little arrow kind of thing. Sometimes you'll see that on the bottom of Mercury. Sometimes that's used to distinguish like planetary Mercury from alchemical Mercury, though that's not always used consistently. And sometimes it's used for other purposes in other alchemical texts. But it is just something you'll see sometimes. But there's the 3 alchemical elements displayed there. So Crowley's obviously doing the correspondence of water to salt, sulfur to fire. He's also doing salt to earth here as well, and then mercury to air. Again, I think this is another place where we don't want to say that like alchemical mercury is air or means the same thing as air. And certainly alchemical salt doesn't mean the same thing as water or mean the same thing as earth. Within the alchemical tradition, these things have lots of other significances, though there are nice correspondences. And so I think it does correspond, but it's not like the same. And you can't reduce the alchemical elements to the 3 mothers or to, fire, water, and air, but they do correspond in nice ways. So we've only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. One other triad that I could have brought in, but again gets a little bit complicated and a little bit messy, is the 3 gunas, which Crowley draws from the Samkhya philosophy, the Indian school of philosophy of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And they do, again, sort of correspond to the alchemical elements and sort of correspond to the three mothers. Sattva would correspond with mercury and with air. Rajas would correspond with sulfur and with fire, and tamas would correspond with salt and with earth. Though they have some different significances. Like tamas is definitely sort of the worst one. I mean, it indicates like in character types, the tamas types are said to be sort of slow and sluggish, almost more animal than human. They have almost no spiritual capacity. And then, the sattva types are much more spiritual and things like that. So there's a kind of hierarchy in them that isn't normally there. One important idea that we can draw from the gunas, and again, what the Indians understand by the gunas doesn't work exactly. Like if you look at some Indian, I was looking at an Indian astrological text called the Yavana Jataka, and the way the planets get lined up with the gunas definitely doesn't happen the same way that we would line the planets up with like the alchemical elements, for instance. So it's important to be careful with that, but it is something that you'll see. Okay, yeah. So we've got just a few minutes. So I was just going to read a couple of things that from Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy on the elements, which I just thought was a kind of nice. Some nice material. And when I presented the last series, I think maybe didn't say enough about what each of the elements are actually like. So I thought it might be nice just to take a few minutes to see some more direct discussion of the qualities of the elements. So Agrippa actually has a lot to say about the elements. So I'm not going to read all of what he says, but just a few kind of excerpts from. This is really early on. This is like chapter 5 of book 1. Okay, so. Let's see. We'll just start with. We'll go with fire first. Let's see. So he says, "Fire in all things and through all things comes and goes away bright. It is in all things bright and at the same time occult and unknown. When it is by itself, no other matter coming to it in which it should manifest its proper action. It is boundless and invisible, of itself sufficient for every action, and is proper to it. Movable, yielding itself after a manner to all things that come next to it, renewing, guarding nature, enlightening, not comprehended by lights that are veiled over, clear, parted, leaping back, bending upwards, quick in motion, high, always raising motions, comprehending another, not comprehended itself, not standing in need of another, secretly increasing of itself, and manifesting its greatness to things that receive it. Active, powerful, invisibly present in all things at once. It will not be affronted or opposed, but as it were in a way of revenge, it will reduce on a sudden things into obedience to itself. Incomprehensible, impalpable, not lessened, most rich in all dispensations of itself. Fire is the boundless and mischievous part of the nature of things, it being a question which it being a question whether it destroys or produceth most things. He goes on for a while, but interesting sort of taste of some of what he says about fire. And then I'll read a little bit what he says about water. He says, "There is so great a necessity of water that without it no living thing can live. No herb nor plant whatsoever, without the moistening of water, can branch forth. In it is the seminary virtue of all things, especially of animals, whose seed is manifestly waterish. The seeds also of trees and plants, although they are earthy, must notwithstanding of necessity be rotted in water before they can become fruitful, whether they be imbibed with moisture of the earth, or with dew or rain, or any other water that is on purpose put to them." Let's see. I'll skip ahead a little here. "Such is the efficacy of this element of water that spiritual regeneration cannot be done without it, as Christ himself testified to Nicodemus. Very great also is the virtue of it in the religious worship of God, in expiations and in purifications. Yea, the necessity of it is no less than that of fire. Infinite are the benefits, and diverse are the uses thereof, as being that by virtue of which all things subsist, are generated, nourished, and increased." All right, and then a little bit about air. Let's see. He says, "It remains that I speak of the air, This is a vital spirit, passing through all beings, giving life and subsistence to all things, binding, moving, and filling all things. Hence it is that the Hebrew doctors reckon it not amongst the elements, but count it as a medium or glue, joining things together, and as the resounding spirit of the world's instrument. Now, I'm not sure when he's talking about the Hebrew doctors here and why air isn't counted as an element. I don't know if this is an idiosyncrasy or another Kabbalistic tradition that Agrippa might have been aware of. That's not clear to me. But he is obviously drawing on this same sort of idea of air as like the binding thing, like when we saw the idea of mem and sheen as the pans of the scale, and air as as aleph, as the thing that reconciled between them or balanced them. He's obviously playing on that same sort of idea here. Let's see, he says it immediately receives into itself the influences of all celestial bodies and then communicates them to the other elements, as also to all mixed bodies. Also, it receives into itself, as if it were a divine-looking glass, the species of all things, as well natural as artificial, as also of all manner of speeches, and retains them, and carrying them with it, and entering into the bodies of men and other animals through their pores, making an impression upon them, as well when they sleep as when they be awake, and affords matters for diverse strange dreams and divinations. All right, and then last I'll read just a paragraph from his comments about Earth. Let's see, he says, now, the basis and foundation of all the elements is the Earth, for that is the object, subject, and receptacle of all celestial rays and influences. In it are contained the seeds and seminal virtues of all things, and therefore it is said to be animal, vegetable, and mineral. It being made fruitful by the other elements and the heavens, brings forth all things of itself. It receives the abundance of all things, and is, as it were, the first fountain, from whence all things spring. It is the center, foundation, and mother of all things. Take as much of it as you please, separated, washed, depurated, subtilized. If you let it lie in the open air a little while, it will, being full and abundant, abounding with heavenly virtues, of itself bring forth plants, worms, and other living things, also stones and bright sparks of metal. Obviously, he's writing in a time when they still thought of the spontaneous generation of life from matter. He says, in it are great secrets, if at any time it shall be purified by the help of fire, and reduced unto its simplicity by a convenient washing. It is the first matter of our creation, and the truest medicine that can restore and preserve us. So again, he has a lot more to say. That's just sort of a taste of some of the stuff he has to say about the four elements. Maybe a point I maybe didn't make when we talked about the kind of transition from the three elements to the four is that Earth is often conceived of as the kind of the crystallization or mixture or synthesis of the other three. So when we have fire, water, and air, aleph, mem, and sheen as the three kind of pure elements, Earth is then the thing that's produced by their admixture. So that's one way of kind of moving from three elements to four elements, is by thinking of the fourth as something sort of derivative from the primary three. Though again, that's not always the way that it's done, but one way. Okay, so we're out of time. I'm happy to hang around for 10 or 15 minutes if people have some questions or comments or anything like that. But yeah, just the basic thing here, we've looked at the three mother letters, aleph, mem, and sheen, and then next week we'll look at the double letters, and we'll talk about planets and planetary symbolism. And then the week after that, we'll talk about the singles or elementals, and talk about the zodiac and other stuff. So yeah, like I said, hopefully, if you're not familiar with the Hebrew alphabet, this was easy enough to follow along with. We really only had three letters that we were talking about and repeating. But next week, when we get into the doubles, there'll be more Hebrew. So if you don't recognize the Hebrew alphabet, you can't just sort of identify the letters by sight. That might be something to practice over the next week. Also, if you're vaguely familiar with 777 or fairly new to it, it might be nice to kind of like play around with it, to sort of look at the different tables, try to figure out why it's being organized the way it is. That'll help as well if you have a little more familiarity with that. And hopefully as we go through, you'll gain a better and better sense of how to actually use 777 in practice. Yeah, thanks everybody. Oh yeah, so here's contact information I always show at the end of the classes. For more about Temple to Silver Star, academic track or initiatory track, you can go to tots.org or write to info@tots.org. If you want to contact me personally, there's my email address. And we do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member of either the academic or the initiatory track. If you already are a member, you already contribute to our work. But if you're not, we do a $5 suggested donation, which you can send via PayPal to payments@tots.org. Yeah, thanks everybody. This has been a nice, I've been enjoying kind of going through some of this material and going back and looking at some of the foundations of these systems and trying to organize my own thoughts about them. So yeah, it's been a nice opportunity for me too. Yeah, and hopefully next time we'll spend a little less time on the Sefer Yetzirah and some of its basic ideas, and we can spend more time talking about like the planets and not just the 7 double letters. And then once we've got sort of planets and elements, that'll build us up nicely for being able to talk about the zodiac. And then once we've got that, we've got the complete set of things, and then we can jump into a more detailed look at each of the letters and paths individually, and the tarot cards as well. Thanks, Hannah. I'll say hi to the cat. That was Hobbes, the very bad one. All right, everybody. Well, I don't see any more comments coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.